According to the theory of evolution, the origin and development of the universe and all its systems can be explained solely on the basis of time, chance, and continuing processes. All living things have arisen from a single-celled organism. A second and opposing worldview is the concept of creation. According to the theory of creation, everything in the universe has come into being through the design, purpose, and deliberate acts of a supernatural creator. That means this creator created the universe, the earth, and all life on earth, including all types of plants and animals, as well as humans. On today's edition of Origins, Noah's flood, washing away millions of years.
Hello, my friends. My name is Don Chapman, and I'm the host of Origins. It's wonderful having you with us today, and we're also so blessed today to have with us Dr. Terry Mortensen. Dr. Terry is a speaker with Answers in Genesis, and he's here today to talk to us about Noah's flood. Terry, it's so great to have you with us today.
Good to be back with you, Don.
You know, I noticed as we were getting ready for the show, and I looked at your slides, that the first slide, we have the subtitle for Noah's flood, and it's Washing Away Millions of Years. Now, I always thought that the Noah's Ark was just about a nice little story for children's programs. Is there more to it than that?
Oh, absolutely, Don. And I found, as I've spoken on this subject to Christians and non-Christians, that a lot of people are trying to figure out the history of the world, and they completely ignore Noah's flood. But it is critical to understanding the history of the world.
Well, how does the church look at at Noah's flood, and where does it fit in?
Well, let's go back and have a little history lesson, Don.
All right.
For about 1,800 years, the church was in unanimous agreement that Noah's flood was a historical global catastrophe. And every one of those words is important. Historical, it really happened in time, space, history. It was global. It covered the whole planet. There was no dry land anywhere when the flood reached its highest level. And it was a catastrophe. It was a catastrophic event of unimaginable magnitude. And those who paid any attention to the fossils over those 1,800 years, there weren't very many, but they viewed the fossils on the mountains and in the rocks as evidence of Noah's flood. But in the early 19th century is when the idea of millions of years was born, and Christians who accepted those millions of years had to reinterpret the flood. And so in that time period, we had two new views that developed, or actually three. One was the historical local catastrophe. That is, it really happened in time, space, history, but it didn't cover the whole planet. It was localized in the Mesopotamian valley of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which is modern-day Iraq.
Right.
So it's just, in this view, it's just described in Genesis in exaggerated language. And then there was the historical global tranquil flood view. Christians said, no, it's really describing a global flood, and it really happened in history, but they said it was a tranquil flood. It was so peaceful, it left no geological evidence, so we don't have to try to harmonize the Genesis flood with what the geologists are saying about millions of years. I don't know anybody who believes in the global tranquil flood anymore. That's actually an oxymoron.
I was just thinking that catastrophic flood would be one that wiped out your house, and a tranquil flood would be one that wiped out the other guy's house. So
Yeah, that's right.
I think floods, by definition, are catastrophes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that view, I don't know anybody who holds that view. But there's one more view that developed in the 19th century, and that is the view of liberal theologians that you guys are all wrong. This flood never happened. If you believe in the tooth fairy and Santa Claus, then you can believe in the myth of Noah and the ark. Let's look at a couple of things that the biblical text tells us. First of all, the purpose of the flood. The purpose of the flood was spelled out very clearly in Genesis. It says in Genesis chapter 6, "The Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things to the birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. Then God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of them, and behold, I am about to destroy them with the earth." So the first thing we see here is that the purpose of the flood was not to destroy sinful man. It was to destroy sinful man and the animals and the birds and the earth itself. And
The judgment of God was to be complete.
Right, and only a global flood would accomplish that purpose. Because if the flood was only in the Mesopotamian Valley, the birds and the animals living in North America, South America, Africa, China could care less.
Scripture clearly says it's all of them. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Then next, we see the purpose of the ark. The purpose of the ark was not to save a few animals so Noah could start a farm after the flood. The Bible tells us very clearly in Genesis chapter 7 that Noah was to enter the ark, you and all your household, for you alone I have seen to be righteous before me in this time. You shall take with you 2 of every clean animal by sevens, a male and his female, and of the animals that are unclean, 2, a male and his female, and also the birds of the sky by sevens, male and female. Why? To keep offspring alive on the face of the earth. Now, if the flood was local, that's totally unnecessary because they'd already be living alive everywhere else.
Right.
So the reason that God gave the command to build the ark was ludicrous if the flood was local. But if it was global, that's the only way those creatures would survive and repopulate the earth. Then let's look at the ark itself. You know, in a lot of children's books about the ark, even Christian children's books, they picture the ark like this. But nothing could be farther from the truth. That is not what the ark looked like. So we need to get that one out of our mind. The Bible tells us the dimensions of the ark, and it was the equivalent of 560 railroad stock cars. 3 levels. It was 1.5 football fields long, about 2/3 of a football field wide, and 4 stories tall.
That would have been so unprecedented in its day, wouldn't it?
It was, although we have testimony that the ancients built some very large boats, but no boat, as far as we know, was built this big again until 1860. So it was a huge boat. Well, a lot of people, skeptics especially, scoff at this idea and say, how could you get all the animals on the ark? And furthermore, how did Noah and his 3 sons and their wives feed them all? What did they do with all the waste products? How did they get fresh water? All of those skeptical type questions have been answered in this book that's available on our website, Noah's Ark, a Feasibility Study. And John Woodmarappy, who wrote this book, spent 7 years of research, and he has thought of just about every question you could think of. And I bet you he's thought of some questions the skeptics never thought of. But let's look at another aspect of the flood revealed in Genesis, and that is the character of the flood. In Genesis 7, it tells us in the 600th year of Noah's life is when the flood came, and it says the 2 sources of the water. On the same day, the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were open. So 2 sources of the water. The waters came from the rains above. The next verses tells us that it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. And then the waters came from below. The fountains of the great deep
What
burst
does
open.
that mean?
Well, this word great deep in the Old Testament in Hebrew is usually referring to the oceans. So this is talking about subterranean water that's supplying the oceans. And we have that today. We have springs of water coming into the bottom of the ocean. This word here in Hebrew is one word. It's very interesting. It's a Hebrew verb, and it's used elsewhere in the Bible to talk about earthquakes.
Oh.
And so this verse is indicating to us that at the beginning of the flood and through the first part of the flood, this was a violent, violent catastrophe. Not only was it violent at the beginning, it also had power in the recessional stage. And then, Don, when we go to the later stage of the flood, in Genesis chapter 8, we read, "The waters receded steadily from the earth, and at the end of 150 days the waters decreased." In the Hebrew, the word steadily is actually two verbs, which are two very common verbs, and it literally says, the waters receded, going and returning. So that's telling us not only is there a steady recession, but the waters are moving back and forth. Right. And when waters are moving, they have erosive power. So you would have erosion at the first part of the flood, but you're going to have erosion at the last part of the flood too, as the flood waters are receding.
It's moving earth, coming and going.
That's right. Yes. That's right. And then there's a very important verse in Psalm 104, which is talking about the flood. And it says, "The mountains rose and the valleys sank down to the place which you established for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass over, so that they will not return to cover the earth." So as the waters were receding, part of the mechanism for that water receding was that the mountains rose. Part of the crust of the earth arose in one place, and part of it sank in another.
So you see the plates of the earth moving in
That's right.
Incredible cataclysmic event.
And so, for creationists, we don't invoke some miracle that God just caused the water to disappear. He actually moved the continents, and the water that was covering the earth is now in our ocean basins.
He's telling us where the water went.
That's right.
Think of that.
And so there's enough water on the earth today to cover the complete planet to a depth of 3 kilometers. All we have to do is raise the ocean basins and lower the mountains. So we got plenty of water.
That's fascinating.
Now, we've been talking about this earthquake and volcanic activity, flood waters. If we combine what we saw in Turkey a few years ago with this massive earthquake, and the devastation was incredible. And we combine that with the flood in Nicaragua a few years ago, and we just have a catastrophe of unimaginable magnitude. And look at that water.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you like to just dip a glass in there and get a drink? Or swim in that? If we could do a stop-action cut through there, we would see that water is brown because it's carrying sediments, rocks, boulders.
Millions of tons of stuff moving.
Those buildings didn't survive that.
No.
So the flood was violent beyond imagination, and anything on the land was ripped up. The plants, the animals, everything. And many of those creatures got buried in those sediments, which were turned to fossils. And then we look at the depth of the flood. The Bible talks about in Genesis 7 that the waters prevailed more and more, and all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. And the waters prevailed 15 cubits, or about 22 feet higher, and the mountains were covered. So water seeks a level plane. If I were pouring water on your head, it wouldn't just pile up on your hair, it would run down your shoulders.
That's right.
And the only way to cover the mountains everywhere under heaven is for a global flood. So a local flood is really impossible if we're going to take seriously the biblical text. But, you know, when people believe in a local flood, this is what they believe in, whether they realize it or not. This is not an actual photograph.
There better be a piece of plexiglass there, or that isn't making any sense.
This is an artistic representation of the ark on a local flood. But no such flood exists. Yeah. And the Mesopotamian Valley has some mountains on there, but the Tigris and Euphrates flow into the Persian Gulf. Yeah. So there's nothing on the end to stop all that water. No. So then what do you have to believe if you believe in a local flood? You have to believe that God supernaturally put His hands around that water to keep it in one place.
But that's not what the Bible says God did, so it makes no sense.
It not only is not what the Bible says, but God is going out of His way to tell us it wasn't local, it was global. And so the Genesis record is describing a global flood. Now there's one other evidence, there's more than we can say, but for today, there's one other evidence in Genesis that this was a global flood. And that is the rainbow promise in Genesis chapter 9. After the flood waters had receded and Noah came off the ark with all the animals, God made a promise that never again would He destroy the earth with a flood. And the sign of His promise was the rainbow. Now, this passage in Genesis 9 is really interesting. It's one of those passages where you kind of scratch your head and you say, you know, God, the Bible is awful long. You keep repeating yourself here in this passage. And if you just not repeat it so much, the Bible would be shorter. And he makes a promise here. And what's interesting is he doesn't make the promise to Noah. He makes the promise to Noah and all his descendants, to the animals and all of their offspring, and the birds and all of their offspring, and he makes the promise to the earth itself. And that promise can only be valid if this was a global flood. If it was a local flood, then God lied. Because there have been many local floods that have killed some birds and some animals and some people and destroyed some of the earth. But only a global flood fits this promise.
That he'd never again destroy the whole earth with a flood.
That's right.
So
and
that implies that in that case he had covered the whole earth with a
That's
flood.
right.
Yeah.
And that means that when we look at a rainbow today, it should be a sober reminder to us of that horrific event in the past.
Well, Terry, this is a question that I have regarding that. Why do people want to argue for a local flood? Isn't there evidence all over the world that the flood has been there? Obviously, the Grand Canyon is a long ways off from Iraq, and yet we have the evidence there. Isn't it true that you can go anywhere in the world and see evidence of the flood?
Oh, that's exactly right, and we want to talk about that some more, even in a later program when we talk about the geological evidence, because they really are screaming Noah's flood.
Is there.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so thankful that not only is the evidence for the flood there, but the promise of God is there, that man has a lot of things to worry about, but a worldwide flood isn't one of them anymore, because God's not going to do it that way.
That's right.
I think from now on we have more to worry about from fire than we have from floods.
That's right. That's right.
We've got to take a break right now, but when we come back from the break, Terry and I are going to talk about this whole idea of how the flood covered the whole earth and what that means in terms of our worldview. So stay with us. We'll be back with you real soon.
Creation versus evolution. You weigh the evidence. The global flood, a saltwater legacy. The existence of salt lakes and inland seas provides strong evidence that there's been a global flood. The huge salty Caspian Sea is landlocked and has been shrinking in size. Lake Van, near Mount Ararat, and Lake Urmia are excellent examples of high elevation, landlocked salty lakes. How did water get so far inland? Why didn't it dry up a long time ago? A gigantic flood within the last 5,000 years would seem a very good answer. Today's guest on Origins, Dr. Terry Mortensen, is also the author of a new book entitled The Great Turning Point. You'll definitely want this book for your personal library. Book orders are being taken at 1-800-778-3390. That's 1-800-778-3390. Dr. Mortensen is also a speaker, researcher, and writer for Answers in Genesis. For more information, write to Answers in Genesis, P.O. Box 510, Hebron, Kentucky 41048, or visit them online at www.answersingenesis.org.
Hi, we're back with Dr. Terry Mortensen. We're talking about Noah's flood, and is it feasible, is it realistic, and was it worldwide? Dr. Terry, if we're talking about a worldwide flood, that means there should be evidence all over the world. How do you see that? Is the physical evidence there to verify and justify a worldwide flood?
Well, we believe that there is. And, you know, if you think of water covering the whole earth, destroying all the land animals and birds, and ripping up things and erosion and sedimentation, you'd expect to find what Buddy Davis, a musician with Answers in Genesis, has made famous in his song. He says, billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. That's what we should expect to find from a worldwide flood. And that's exactly what we find, is billions of dead things buried in rock layers that were once wet sand, sediment, mud, clay, and burying many creatures, and then we find it all over the earth. And that's precisely what we find. We find fossils on the tops of all of our high mountains.
That's right.
So, but the evolutionists say, no, that's not true. The flood never happened. Where did they get this idea of millions of years? Well, they got it from the geological record. Back in the 19th century, 200 years ago, they began looking at the rocks. They rejected the biblical account of Noah's flood. They said, we've got to do our geological work as if the Bible doesn't even exist, and with the assumptions of an atheistic or a deistic view of the world, they tried to interpret the rocks. And so they came up with the idea that all of this fossil record, which is a record of death and pain and killing and disease and extinction, was the evidence of the development of life over millions and millions of years. This idea was developed before Darwin published his theory. The idea of millions of years actually gave Darwin the time he needed for his theory.
To make it work.
But increasingly, the scientific evidence is showing that the fossil record is not the record of millions of years of development. It's the record of the death of all life in Noah's flood. Now, there's some sediments that are post-flood deposits, and those are localized, and a few sediments that it would be pre-flood, but most of it is the result of Noah's flood.
The vast majority, we believe, is there because of Noah's flood. So you sort of have a choice of a little bit of water and millions of years, or a lot of water and a lot of catastrophe in a short period of time, which really makes more sense for how you get all those fossils and all those shells and everything on the tops of mountains.
And in fact, just look at this, Don. The Grand Canyon. The evolutionists tell us that this mile of sedimentary rocks was deposited over at least 300 million years. And they've told us for many, many decades, people that went out to the national park there in Grand Canyon, the park rangers would tell them that it was the Colorado River that cut the Grand Canyon. I've been on the Colorado River. It flows right down through this little crack here. And you just look at that and think for a moment. There's no way that the Colorado River cut that canyon. It's 4 to 18 miles wide.
Yeah.
If it cut this, it wasn't the Colorado River. We're changing the meaning of Colorado River. And in fact, there are geologists today who are even evolutionists who are very knowledgeable of the Grand Canyon, who are saying this was not carved by a little bit of water over a long period of time. This was carved by a lot of water over a short period of time.
It sure makes a lot more sense to me.
Yeah. Now, creation scientists believe, who have studied the Grand Canyon, they believe that the rock layers here were the deposit of Noah's flood, but that the canyon was actually formed in a post-flood erosional event. As the flood waters were receding off the earth, some of them got trapped up here in the northeast side of the Grand Canyon, and eventually they breached a natural dam because there's the rocks are uplifted here on this end, and that this was carved very rapidly in a short period of time. So the evidence of Noah's flood is all around us, and the Grand Canyon is one of the most incredible testimonies to that. You can learn a lot more about the flood and the impact of the flood on our website and AnswersInGenesis.org. And I'd just like to close and encourage your viewers to consider this verse from the book of Isaiah. God says, "To the law and to the testimony, if they speak not according to this word, it is because there is no light in them." And so God is saying that His word is the basis by which we understand the world that we live in.
And if we can't see that, it's because the light of God isn't in our hearts.
That's right.
You know, my friends, it's so good having Dr. Terry with us to talk about Noah's flood and how it sort of washes away the millions and millions of years. Some of you have never looked at the whole perspective of what's happened in the earth from the perspective of God's creation. And you know, it's not just that we want to look at creation itself. It's that we want to look at the whole picture of Genesis 1 to 11. And when we do that, we see that the events in Genesis make sense the creation, the fall, men being scattered to the corners of the earth, and then the great catastrophe of the flood. When you put all those pictures together, and then you look at the evidence of the world, it makes perfect sense. Listen, if you have questions about what we've been talking about, or if you have questions you'd like us to talk about on Origins, please write me at Origins, CTV, Wall, PA, 15148, or there at the email address on your screen. Don't hesitate to send me your questions. We'll do our best to find the right expert to get you the right answer. But in the meantime, I just want you to remember this one thing with me, friend. Remember that it's God's worldview that He made you, and that ought to be your worldview too. See you next time, and God bless you.
Thank you for watching this edition of Origins. If you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint information presented today, you can download a PDF file of program number 509 from our website at www.originstv.org. Or for a DVD of this series, send a $12 donation to cover shipping and handling and write to Origins program number 509, Cornerstone Television, Wall, Pennsylvania 15148.
Origins is made possible by the faithful prayers and the financial support of you, our Cornerstone Television family.